Perfect. So that's the recording started, Agnes. So firstly, an introduction to Barnthorne Publishing. We are I say we're a fairly new publisher. It's nearly our first anniversary, which it feels crazy to say. We have a lot of military history titles, but as with this book, we've got a lot of titles in the pipeline in other areas such as property, poetry, fiction, short novels, etc. So we're very much open to all kinds of genres. New authors like Agnes, this is Agnes's first title, or experienced authors, and we have several of those who have multiple books already behind them. So if you have an idea for a publication, then reach out. You can find all the contact details on our social media and our website, which is barnthornepublishing.co.uk. So I'm going to hand over to Agnes to introduce herself and a bit about your background, Agnes.
So I'm, as I said, a first-time writer, and I'm currently reading Classical Civilizations and the Ancient World at King's. Now, my background as a writer is that when I was from the age of a very small child, I've always loved reading. And I would have, if I was sent to my room as a child for being naughty, I'd just stay in there for hours and read books. It wouldn't faze me. And so since a young age, I would write little pieces of poetry, little pieces of short stories. I would always try and write, when I was a small child, picture books. And eventually after came through COVID and did my A-levels. And after that, I was left with kind of nothing to do. And I thought, I'm going to actually try and write a poetry anthology with a kind of theme to it, as this one has, and try and get it published. So I wrote it last year, and I finished it in October. And since then, it's been the kind of journey to here to get it published.
Yeah, and obviously congratulations on your first publication. So obviously I know, but for the benefit of the audience, how did that journey start once you'd written the anthology? How did you get it to where we are today?
So the first thing that I did is looked online to see if there were any agents that represented first-time poets, and the answer is there aren't any, really. And I sent my I sent my manuscript to about 20 agents, and I got rejection. And then I sent it directly to a few publishers who accepted unrepresented manuscripts, and I got some yeses, but the publishing deals they were very negative for me as an author, because I would be having to put money towards the publication, or I would be making no royalties on the books, or I'd have to give up the copyright. And I didn't want that, and I was feeling really down, and I thought, this is the end. This anthology is never going to get published. And then it was actually my partner said, have you tried Barnthorne Publishing? And introduced me to Barnthorne, showed me their social media, explained to me what it was. And I was then put in touch with you, Ashley, and my anthology had a meeting, and then they said, yeah, great, I'm going to publish the anthology.
Indeed, and I think, as you touched on, when we say meeting, like we just reached out on Zoom like this. It's very, very informal. We like to meet our authors or poets, and and have that face-to-face conversation and understand what it is you're looking to achieve, and see how we can fit into the journey with you. So no, that's great. So before we just go on to the anthology itself, you mentioned obviously as a child you had favorite authors, possibly poets as well. Just wondered if there was any particular ones of those that inspired you either then or now, really. Any favorites?
I would say William Blake. When I was a very small child, I didn't like poetry. I thought it was all, even poetry for children or Edward Lear funny poems, I thought, no. And then when I was doing my GCSE for English, I got introduced to the poetry of Lord Byron. And from there, I kind of went through all the romantic poets. But I always come back to my favorite poet, which is William Blake, with his Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. And there was just something about that little collection of, I think it's 54 poems. It's a small anthology that just, I could read it over and over and over again. And just the way he constructs such long and short poems with these beautiful rhyming schemes just really, for me, fanned that fire of poetry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something from your own anthology. You've got that variety in terms of the length of the poems. Some are very short, some are, you know, considerably longer, and I think that makes it quite refreshing to read. You know, from a reader's perspective, that you can kind of dip in and out if you like, and oh, I'll just read this one and then, you know, go on and do whatever I need to do, get off the train or wherever you are. So I think that's really refreshing. And I think that obviously seems to chime with your inspiration there. So in terms of the anthology, do you want to kind of give an overview of the like the you know the overarching kind of subjects? You know, how this has kind of been split into different sections, etc.
So the anthology is the development of a person from child to poetess. And I don't mean that it's necessarily my development exactly, but a lot of it is inspired by my development from being a small child to being a poetess. Well, I guess I can say that. So it starts with the portrait of the final product and ends with the reason for hope. So it's kind of, it's a little bit of, it's a prolepsis. It starts with the end. And then there's lots of different, there's the troubled childhood, the school years, unrequited love, simple madness. There's all these themes, but the most important of which I would say is eating disorders and bipolarity, because those were the two themes in my personal life that really pushed me to write this anthology, that really gave me a lot of the inspiration for not just those sections, but the anthology as a whole.
Yeah, and I think they are very much from the heart, and you can kind of feel the, you know, the strength of that as you read some of the poems. And I mean that, as you say, you know, some of this is based on, you know, your real life events as such, and then obviously other kind of inspirations or ideas have been blended into that, and you've ended up with this. And I think, yeah, the having that first poem, which, as you say, starts at the end, that was quite novel for me to read. You don't really see that often, in terms of you start reading a book but you're at the end and you kind of then, you know, pick up the pieces from there. So that's great. um so in terms of like your method of writing poems, like how do you go about it? Is it something you know, they just come out and they're, you know, they're done, or is it something you work on over a period of time, or something else?
So it's a bit of a mixed bag, depending, it changes from poem to poem. So some poems just kind of, I suddenly get a spark and they come out of me in a flow, and the first draft is either completely perfect for me or it just needs minor tweakings. I tend to jot down in that I always keep a diary. It's my writer's sketchbook. So in the back of my diary, I always keep a space that I use just to write down rhymes that come to my head, or sentences, or little short story ideas. So sometimes when I have a bit of a writer's block, I go to the back of the diary and there's already a line that I can use as a jumping off point. Sometimes I deliberately write a poem inspired by something, whether it be a story that I read, or something I've seen on the news, or even an object that for whatever reason seems particularly beautiful. So it depends, poem to poem, and also kind of day to day what my writing for the day is looking like.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess linking back to your kind of the overall structure of the anthology, you've then got that kind of those themes that you've worked towards, and I guess, you know, you had that in mind beforehand of, you know, these are the key sections here, and I'm gonna kind of, you know, pick up the, let's say, the strand of this from here and the strand of that from there. So yeah, no, that makes complete sense. So I guess with these talks, we don't want to give the whole book away, because naturally the idea is for people to go and buy the book, um, which we'll come on to towards the end. But I think you're gonna read one of the poems that features, and give us a bit of an explanation to the background to it, you know, and how it's come about.
So the poem I'm going to read is from Finding the Pen, which is one of the sections in the book, and it's called The Moths. The moths line up upon the window panes, attracted not to the writer's lamp, but to the woman who sits behind it, her decaying clothes, hair, and body. The moths are waiting for the writer to die. If she opens the window still alive, the line of moths won't move. But when the writer's hand goes still at her desk, the moths shall force their way through, to feed on her where she lays slumped. No mourners come to stop the moths, nor as witness to their unusually carrion display. The writer therefore shall remain slumped, as she always was night and day, until the moths have eaten her and her desk completely away.
Very good. Well,
So
thanks for reading that.
that's actually a very interesting example of real life inspiration in poetry, because at home in Hampshire, my writer's desk sits in a bay window and it looks out at the countryside. And I have a lamp that I sit, because the ceiling light's not very good, that I put on the desk so that I can continue writing in winter when it's, 4 o'clock and dark. And I looked up one evening and my entire window was just covered with moths that were attracted to the lamp that was sitting on my desk. And I was in the middle of writing the anthology and I thought, well, that'd be a brilliant poem.
There you go. That's an example of inspiration, isn't it? Just like that. You can make it up.
And that was it. And because I had that real life example, that just tended to flow out and only needed a few minor alterations, but it was pretty much good from the get-go. But that doesn't always happen. Some poems are really tricky and they take weeks working through draft after draft, making huge alterations to get right.
And I guess on the flip side, are there any that don't make the cut as such, where they end up in the scrap pile as such, or they're kind of pushed back for another time?
Absolutely. So the anthology is 88 poems, and originally it was 100, and of those 116 of them I ended up, when I started laying out the manuscript, so I handwrite everything and then I type it on a typewriter and then I put it on the computer. But when I organize my manuscripts, it's all on the typewriter sheets. So there were poems, as I was organizing them into the different sections, 16 of them didn't make the cut because I just couldn't work with them. So to this day, they're sat in a pile waiting to be edited. And that kind of happens as I go along, that sometimes just randomly I'll be able to pick up a poem and fix it, but sometimes I won't.
Yeah, well, you never know when you might need them, I
guess I can't separate them. It'd be like throwing away a piece of myself.
Indeed, and obviously, with your fairly young years, I think it's fair to say there's a whole lot of material to come in your life. So if you've almost documented these aspects of your life or of other events, and that inspiration is going to obviously continue to flow, and probably with it your style will establish itself. You'll be more practiced in what you do, etc. So more for the good. So I mean, I guess it's a good time to ask, are you working on any other projects at the moment, writing wise?
I am. So I've got quite a few plates spinning at the moment. So currently, day to day, I'm working on a novel that's written as a series of diary entries from the prospect of a 18-year-old girl who's going through all these life problems, but the older self is giving introductions to each of the kind of diary entries as you go through. I also have a second anthology that I'm working on. That's about halfway finished, but I'm doing it much slower this time. And then sort of 2 collections of short stories are also bubbling away at the back of my mind.
Well, plenty to be keeping you busy then. So I guess with the novel, how, like the diary, etc., how does that compare to the writing of the poetry?
I think there's certain similarities in terms of the vocabulary and in terms of the themes of the novel, because you have to write what you know how to write. So it's easy when you have to write a problem to base that on a problem that you've experienced yourself. I would say there's two distinct voices in the novel. One is the voice of the teenage girl, and the other is the voice of the older self. And I would say that the voice of the older self is closer to the style of the anthology than the voice of the teenage girl.
Okay. Yeah, so that will be quite interesting to contrast in the future when you've finished that. And I guess obviously then contrasting with that second anthology, which I'm assuming, does that kind of pick up where the other left off, or is it a different style of?
It's a different, I've got a name for it already. I'm calling it my eclectic collection, because it's more, rather than being the development of something in the form of an anthology, it's more different themes from life that are all kind of put together. So there is that same element where real life is the basis for what the poems are written on, but it's more eclectic, less targeted, I'd say, than this anthology.
Yeah, that makes sense. So just a reminder for those watching, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat so I can pick those up. And obviously there'll be an opportunity soon to ask them directly if you'd rather do that over microphone, camera. I think we're going to just cover the important bit where you can buy Agnes's book. Obviously it's been on the market for a few weeks now, so it's on Amazon predominantly. You can also buy copies directly from our website, which helps support us as an independent publisher. And I don't think you've got any copies, Agnes, directly. Is it, if anyone wanted a signed copy?
No, I don't have, I only have one copy, which is my copy of the book. I don't have any.
Fair enough. Well, we can arrange that. If anyone suddenly, if you're inundated with signed copy requests, I'm sure we can sort that as well. So I'm just going to admit we've got a late entry to the Zoom, so I'm just going to admit them quickly. Perfect, that should be done. Right, so I mean, I've not got any other questions at this stage, so I'm going to open the floor to any questions from the audience members, or indeed Neil, if you've got any questions, and then yeah, we can go from there. As I say, if you prefer putting any questions in chat, please do that instead, or you can unmute yourselves and ask questions as well. While that's happening, Agnes, how are your studies going at King's?
They're going very well. I had an email today to say you have progressed into second year, so I shall be continuing with my studies.
Very good. So how do you find the time while studying, you know, for the degree versus obviously doing your writing as well?
Well, for me, I'm quite lucky in that I'm doing a degree that I love and I find very passionate. So it's not like work. It's, you know, it's not grueling or boring to me. So I tend to, during the day when I have gaps in my day between lectures, I tend to get all my schoolwork done then, which means when I get home, I have the entire evening to write and wander about my room and think about writing, and then read, which inspires writing. Or if I do have any work, it's only going to take, you know, I get home at between 6 and 8 o'clock, and I don't go to bed until midnight. So it's only going to take up kind of an hour, and then I have the rest of the evening to write.
Perfect. Oh, plenty of time. Right, I've got a couple of questions that have started coming in. So the first one was, which theme would you say was the hardest to write about, and equally, which was the easiest to write about?
I'd say the hardest to write about was actually a mature realization that writing about being very hopeful for the future, it's a lot more interesting to write about everything that's going wrong rather than everything that will go right. So I'd say that was the hardest, just because trying to get into that hopeful mindset when writing after you've just written all these horrible, bad, you know, it's quite a difficult switch to make. The easiest I would say to write about would be the theme of the eating disorder, because that's been such a big part of my life from such a young age. And, you know, spending hours in doctors' offices, and it's just, when something is such a big part of your life, it's so easy to draw inspiration from, because you see so many different sides of it.
I mean, was that, I guess, in some respects, I mean, perhaps writing about those themes may have, on one hand, been liberating in terms of maybe getting it off your chest as such and unpacking it, but perhaps equally, you know, ripping off the plaster and opening up the wounds as well. So, I mean, you know, how would you feel about either of those?
So I found it more liberating, because to me, it's like, here's this problem in my life, and I'm able to give it a physical form. And then in that physical form, because that's going to go off to a publisher, I'm able to kind of send it away from me in that physical form. I would say, in terms of the ripping off the plaster, it more created self-conscious wounds, in that there was an element where you think, this is mine, and this is private, and I don't want anyone reading it. So there are certain poems, I think, that haven't been written because of that feeling of wanting it to stay private. So it's a give and take.
And I think if they have been written, I think the poet or poetess would be a lot more, shall we say, hidden. You know, they wouldn't be prepared to come and do a video Zoom such as this, and perhaps a podcast, because you can kind of, you know, you're not on camera as such. But you know, so obviously, I think total respect for, you know, for being yourself and being vulnerable, because I think that's what a lot of people can appreciate. Um, Very much picking up on that question, someone else has asked, do you have a favourite theme to write about?
Well, my favorite theme to write about is actually, at the moment, is death and time, which seems really macabre, but the process of aging is such a beautiful and such a finite and inescapable thing, as is time and as is death, that to write about them, there's so much you can say, which makes it so fun to write about, because there's so much material there for you to play with and for you to write about, and to have so many different metaphors and similes all about one theme. So I expect those two will feature heavily in the next anthology, just because I'm having so much fun with them at the moment. But from this anthology, the easiest subject to write about was, again, it was the eating disorders, and it was bipolarity, because they were, and still are to an extent, such huge parts of my life, that there's just so much material there to work with.
Yeah, of course, that makes sense. Another question was, which books, poems, or literary works in general would you recommend to someone who is looking to become a writer? Any tips in general in terms of becoming a writer?
I would say, if you're going to become a poet, then I would have to recommend Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience by William Blake, because of the variety of poems there. And I would also recommend, Chris Riddell did a series of anthologies that he collected, called Poems to Save the World With, Poems to Fall in Love With, and another one that I can't remember. But his poems are just the way he structured those anthologies with illustrations are so beautiful, and so, I mean, I cherish my copies of them. So they provide a huge, I mean, a young poet looks at an anthology the same way a young architect looks at a building. You know, how did this come about? So I would say, if you're going to want to be a poet, then those books are the ones I would recommend. To become a writer in general, when I think about my novel writing, I go back to the classics. But for me, the most beautiful book ever written is Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, because it uses so many devices and so many forms of imagery, and there's no book quite like it. So I would say that is brilliant for me. Personal recommendations, Possession by A.S. Byatt. It's not a fantastic read, but the way it's structured in a series of string of consciousness, letters, poems, and narration. Just if you're going to look at a book to deconstruct, it's a very good example. Anything that just inspires you would be the final thing that I would say, because like I said, a young author looks at a book the same way a young architect looks at a building. So you want that book that inspires you to build your own. So that changes from person to person, I would say.
Definitely, and I think with the subjects as well, as you say, you've got, I mean, the world's your oyster really with inspirations. But I think, I think part of that question as well, in terms of that taking that step to actually become a writer, and and having that the kind of conviction to do that. I think anyone, as the saying goes, everyone's got a good book in them. So why not give it a go and see what happens. We've had another question come in, and I'm also just a kind of final call for any other questions. So how different or similar has your source of inspiration or process been when writing about different themes?
So I would say the process does change from theme to theme because it depends on how I go about writing about it. So with something that I have been experiencing for years, such as bipolarity or an eating disorder, that tends to start just natural, organically. I have no direct source of inspiration other than feelings. And then I would just sit and write about a poem about this aspect of that condition, or, so on and so forth. When it comes to some themes like time, I actually have a page in my notes. I just wrote down loads of things inspired by times. I don't know if I can just show there. That, you probably can't read it, but that's just all different lines about time. And then I went about writing a lot of poems, so that the inspiration was thinking about time. But it does, the process changes from theme to theme completely, depending on what that theme is and how I relate to it.
That makes sense. A question I was going to ask as well is linked to your education. So obviously currently at university, and obviously your previous studies. I guess what have you learned from those as such? Like from, say, when you were writing while you were at say secondary school or college, writing then compared to writing now with that kind of university training, as it were, behind you, has that changed anything for you?
It has. I would say there's two big things that have changed. Number one is my time to read. So I didn't really have my time to write. I didn't really have that at secondary school and sixth form because I had homework that I had to do every night. Whereas when you're at university, you have papers due at certain deadlines, and the work day to day is less. It's harder, but it's less. So one of the big things that's changed about my writing is I now have the time to devote daily time to writing. But in terms of how my university training has changed how I write, I would say that university, with doing classical civilizations, has taught me that each myth has two sides that you can view. So there's so many different versions of myths within the mythology of the ancient Greeks, that now when I write a story, I actually think, how could this change? How could this be viewed differently? Is there a double entendre that I could put here? Is there, how can I change it so that there's more thought on behalf of the reader rather than the writer spelling everything out? Because I find books where the writer spells everything out and gives you a very concrete one way of looking at it is not as enjoyable as more kind of literary fiction, where there's so many different ways you could interpret the situation, the emotions, the character development.
Yeah, makes sense. Just in response to one of the earlier questions, there was a thank you for the answers. I think the recommendations, particularly, there was some were familiar, but also looking forward to exploring some of the new ones that you had mentioned during that. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
And I think that's the end of our questions. So we've had a couple of people come and go while we've been talking. So I'm just going to recap what we said earlier. I think obviously the full video is going to be available on demand. So if you have missed any of the talk or you've had to leave early, you can watch the remainder. It'll be on YouTube probably tomorrow, and then we'll share it on our social medias, etc. In terms of where to buy the book, it's been available on Amazon for the last couple of weeks, so please buy it there. Or if you want to support an independent publisher, you can go to our website, which is barnformpublishing.co.uk, and order it through us. If you're yearning for a signed copy, then please message Agnes, and we will see if we can, between the two of us, arrange that. And yeah, thank you all for your time this evening. But most importantly, thanks to Agnes. I think in this Zoom and in your book, I think you've been very kind of open and vulnerable with your audience. I think some of the subjects are quite hard hitting and raw. And I think that's definitely it comes across. And I think well done to you for doing that. So yeah, on that note, I'm going to end the recording and close the meeting. Any final words, Agnes, before we go?
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for publishing my anthology. This is truly a dream come true.
You're welcome. You're welcome. We look forward to helping you with your next project in due course. Brilliant. Right, I'm going to stop the recording now.